we're gonna have some presentations and some comments to questions, some remarks around those questions, and then I hope to have at least half an hour for debate with the audience, including remote participation. I'm not sure where I'm gonna get those questions, but I hope the volunteers help me with that. So with no more further delay, I just would like to introduce the panelists, just starting from here on. On my right, we have Deborah Brown. She's a senior project coordinator at the Association for Progressive Communication, which many of you may know. It's an organization that has branches all over the world with huge impact in the Global South. Scott Busby, who serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, here in Washington. My colleague Albert Cerda, tenured professor in law and technology at the Center of Studies and Law and Information of the University of Chile, and also a PhD here at Georgetown University. Avery Doria, who is an itinerant researcher consultant with contracts with .ARLC. She's also a VP of Policy and Governance and one of the and also at APC. And she was awarded the ICANN Mood Stakeholder Ethos Award in 2014. So she's an old-timer mood stakeholder cheerleader. For that, if you can imagine Avery with the pompons. And finally, Ben Blink is a senior public policy analyst at Google and a founding member of its Free Expression International Relations team. So Ben also do incredible work trying to reach and build skills in Global South and with Global South practice. So I think we have an incredible panel. We had a lot of calls trying to ensure that we would have a stakeholder view. And I would like to start to actually asking, put Busby on the spotlight and really asking you, how does the US approach its obligations to protect human rights online? And so please provide us with specific examples of principles US support, endorses, and why it decided it could not support others. And if you could, also give examples of some initiatives that would feed into enforcing those principles. So that's just to kick the ball, and then I would love others to comment on his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you for having me here. Let me reiterate something that we and others have said many times before, but I think it bears repeating, which is that we believe that the human rights articulated within the international, standard international treaties on human rights apply online in the same way that they do offline. So that means in particular that the obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights regarding free expression, free association, and assembly, we view those rights as applying online. We don't believe that the internet requires the articulation or development of new rights. Rather, it's a question of simply translating the application of these well-established rights to this new forum. And indeed, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself, it anticipates the fact that there will be new media, amazingly prescient of them, I think. And indeed, that's what we're dealing with now, is a new type of media, a new form of communication to which that particular right of free expression applies. Well, how have we kind of fleshed out our policy of internet freedom, applying human rights online? First, I would urge all of you to look at the President's International Strategy on Cyberspace, which was issued back in 2011. That makes crystal clear our commitment to free expression, to the application of human rights online. Then in terms of action, in that same year, 2011, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton traveled to The Hague and with her counterpart in the Netherlands, as well as a group of other ministers, she helped to found something called the Freedom Online Coalition, which is a coalition of now 23 like-minded governments all of whom signed on to a basic set of principles up front dedicated to promoting internet freedom globally. And this group has met annually at the ministerial level in places like Kenya, Tunisia, and most recently in Tallinn, Estonia, to share ideas, share thoughts, and talk about how we, like-minded governments on these issues, can try to advance the ball collectively. One very specific action that this coalition took was to intervene with a public statement in the case of Vietnam actually it was prior to the adoption of so-called Decree 72 in Vietnam, which had a number of restrictive provisions in it. So we look at doing public statements like that. We look to coordinate private diplomacy with governments where we think there are concerning developments. And most recently, in conjunction with our meeting in Tallinn, we adopted something called the Tallinn Agenda, which is a bit more granular than the founding declaration of the Freedom Online Coalition, and articulates a set of commitments, including with regards to surveillance, kind of what should the coalition aspire to in terms of the principles that guide the work that we do on surveillance, as well as the work we do in other areas like supporting bloggers and like speaking out or intervening in cases where governments engage in activities that we disagree with. In addition, we've been deeply engaged in the UN on these issues. I note that we have former U.S. Ambassador to the Human Rights Council here, Eileen Donahoe, who was instrumental in getting the Human Rights Council in Geneva to focus on this issue back in 2011 under Swedish leadership, but with our strong support. The Human Rights Council adopted its first ever resolution on internet freedom, again reaffirming that the application that the rights articulated offline apply online, among other things. A similar resolution was adopted by the Human Rights Council at its most recent session in June. We were very active in promoting that resolution as well. I should note that while the first resolution was adopted by consensus, which was actually quite a remarkable achievement given that China and others were part of the council at the time, this most recent resolution was more contentious, and indeed the Chinese did propose some amendments to the resolution that were fortunately defeated, but the consensus around the original Internet Freedom Resolution is sort of somewhat in doubt at present. We have also joined and been involved in resolutions at the UN General Assembly, including the resolution last year led by Germany and Sweden on privacy rights, as well as a similar resolution on privacy adopted by the Human Rights Council last March. There will be a panel on the issue of privacy at the upcoming Human Rights Council session. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has just issued a report on this issue as called for by in the General Assembly resolution. And so the debate within the UN will continue, but we will be deeply engaged on that. We in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor have tried to put our money where our mouth is on this issue. We have funded over $100 million worth of activities to support internet freedom, including anti-censorship and secure communication. So for instance, Tor is a grantee of ours. Advocacy around human rights issues online, particularly with the goal of supporting civil society in the developing world. Training on digital safety and security, research, and rapid response mechanisms that can provide urgent assistance to bloggers or others who are at risk because of their online activities. Finally, let me say that in conjunction with colleagues in the State Department like Danny Sepulveda, like Chris Painter, our cyber coordinator, who will be speaking later today. We're engaged deeply in bilateral discussions around these issues. So when Turkey shut down Twitter, we were right there talking to the Turks. Danny, Chris, and I, in fact, engaged Turkey on the margins of the Net Mundial conference in Brazil, where we aren't able to talk to a government. We seek to speak out on countries that engage in practices that are of concern to us from an internet freedom standpoint. So let me leave it at that today.
Thank you very much, Scott. I think that's a very rich set of activities, but I would like others to comment. Is this approach effective? Is it enough? What else should we be doing or not doing? So back to you, Ben, if you want to start from that side and move to the side.
We'll see if everyone hear me okay. All right, so from the business perspective, in terms of role modeling, I can't say how important it is enough about how important the U.S. acting as a role model is for business interests and Google's business interests abroad, those types of things. So I think the international advocacy, the capacity building, and the Internet Governance Forum, those types of things are critical in terms of building international trust and being role models. The other relevant scope here is domestic policy and regarding human rights. And the two human rights that we think about most specifically are the rights of freedom of expression and the rights of privacy. And on rights of freedom of expression, I can't think of a role model that's quite better than the U.S. Back to the Constitution, obviously, we have very strong protections for speech that have translated from the offline world to the online world. CDA 230, protecting intermediaries and those types of things. The U.S. is obviously a very strong role model. When we start thinking about privacy and the surveillance side, though, that's where the trust really breaks down. I think that's where Google especially comes under significant scrutiny, and where U.S. influence and role modeling changes can really help improve trust in this environment. So I think it was just this past week in the Washington Post, there was a Pew study that was released, and they surveyed 36 different countries in 2013 and 2014, and looked at how what their perceptions were of whether the United States protected individuals' civil liberties in their own country. 22 of those 36, perception was the United States had gotten worse, and whether or not they protected individuals' civil liberties. So that's just the international perception of what the U.S. does for their own civil liberties. We can only imagine what they think it does for the rights and human rights of non-U.S. citizens. So, while our role modeling, internationally is critical, and there's great work done by the U.S., I still think there's lots of room to be done regarding surveillance reform and other measures that can help build that trust for the U.S.'s rights-respecting responsibilities. We talk about this a lot on our side, but transparency, it can't be said enough how important that is. Allowing companies like ours to disclose how many requests are being made of us for different types of data. And the U.S. has taken major leaps on that, and there's still certainly room to go there. But just letting citizens know what information is being collected about them, what the United States is doing, is going to be really important if we truly want to be international role models on these issues. The High Commissioner for Human Rights just recently released a report on mass surveillance, the digital mass surveillance, and spoke both about what the private sector and the public sector responsibilities are on these fronts. From the private sector, upholding, considering human rights and using models, similar models that are promoted by the Global Network Initiative, things like pushing back on governments when they're making requests for overbroad information, those types of things. But even more emphasis in the report was about what governments need to do, which is proving that the onus is on governments to show that the information they're collecting, the surveillance and other things, is necessary and proportionate to the ends that they're trying to create. So, I think overall the U.S. is in major trust building mode internationally, and that translates both again in the public and the private sectors. And as we work to be role models on these digital rights issues, I think we need to focus a little bit more on the domestic side and what we can do to prove that we're following the rules that we're setting for the internationally within our own borders.
Thank you, Ben. Avery, do you want to make your remarks?
Thank you. would echo many of the things. One of the things, though, to go back to the beginning that was interesting to me is that it's good now. The U.S. used to talk about freedom of expression, and that was it. And now, in the last year, due to circumstances, we've added privacy as something we talk about more. Hopefully also be able to get into sort of freedom of association at some point. Because what happens, the privacy aspect is actually a compound problem, in that by violating the privacy both externally and internally, you basically prevent the association online that is probably one of the more important parts in terms of countries, more so than the US, but other countries, being able to actually build the freedom movements that they need. And the fact that we have so enabled and so legitimized the notion of peering into people's privacy has actually limited the freedom of association. So one of the things I would hope to hear more of going forward from the US is that there really is a third right that needs to be protected on the internet and needs to be looked at. And once one looks at that, one finds that in many places, people just don't use the internet because of fear. And so it's not just stopping the bad that is somebody blocked something, but that's a part that I'm hoping. I'm glad to see that there is some implementation, because in many cases there's really a lot of wonderful words, and we keep pointing to the words. It's good, whether it's Tor or other things, to see some implementation, but really there needs to be a whole lot more activity that's visible, so that when, going abroad as someone that travels on a U.S. passport, and having to always admit that before I make any other comments, you can point to things other than words. The last thing I'd like to throw into the mix is in groups like, and I don't know enough about the Freedom Online Coalition, whether it works in a multi-stakeholder model. I know that HRC doesn't. And in fact, that's always been one of the real problems in my perception. And I don't know whether that's something that's on the U.S. agenda. I know another place the U.S. agenda does include opening things up more to civil society and businesses and such, and sort of opening them up in an equitable way so that the civil society people can get there. But it's one of the things that I've noticed with HRC is this whole everybody appeal, getting in line and quickly pushing their buttons so that they can get a 2-minute statement. So I'm wondering whether that can also be part of the U.S. Human rights position is sort of getting that opened up more to multi-stakeholder processes.
Perfect. Alberto, could you bring a little bit the academic view for that discussion? And I would like also you to address this third right that Avery brought up.
Good morning. I will start by saying that I'm not an American scholar or citizen. I'm from Chile. My experience is more related with how to intersect human rights with internet regulation in my own country. And I've tried to pay attention to the development of these issues also overseas. I think that it's amazing having the chances to frame the discussion about internet governance from a human rights viewpoint, basically because internet is a global issue. And it doesn't deserve a local solution. It needs a global framework. And human rights is that framework that can provide for some support from pushing forward the development of internet governance. You, Corinne, asked us for two issues, effectiveness and sufficiency. Effectiveness is extremely difficult to measure in the human rights area. There are a lot of studies trying to measure the effectiveness of human rights mechanisms on these issues, but in other too. I will focus in the sufficiency and basically making more explicit attention between international human rights law and the U.S. law and policies or practices and how they are in tension, at least in two issues that there are more. I will highlight two of them. The first one is that most of the American scholarship literature activists civil society organizations, and even some government officials handle human rights with the framework of the American Constitution. So we are talking about human rights, but we keep touching on civil rights, on free speech, on privacy and liberty, and recently on the right to association. But the human rights framework is much more broad. It means also social, cultural, and economic rights. And we are not talking about that. So that creates a tension when we go with this speech of human rights in the internet in foreign places, and at the same time create a challenge for us. And a second challenge is that human rights require countries, and particularly government, not only to respect human rights, meaning to constrain or violating human rights, but also the international human rights law requires to protect and to promote human rights. And when the international human rights law is asking for protect and promote human rights, it's not talking only about doing that with respect to officials, police officers, or judges, but also non-state actors. And that is super important in the case of internet. Internet is mainly a private environment. How much of this infrastructure is owned by private actors? 95% of the infrastructure. They assign lines, they support services, they provide services. Almost every single action that takes place in the internet is controlled by private actors. But in our understanding, and when I say our understanding, in the US understanding, human rights issues seems to be only an issue of, as some of the speakers say, authoritarian governments and oppressive regimes. It's not. Human rights is a challenge for all countries, even democratic countries. And we have challenge in Chile. And you have challenge too if you want to fulfill your commitment on the human right before international human rights law. It's not only about free speech and soft privacy. It's much more than that.
Thank you, Alberto, for calling our attention to that broad frame and view. Deborah, do you want to bring your contributions as a civil society representative?
Sure. Thank you, Carolina, and good morning to everyone. I think I want to start by picking up on one of the first points made, which is that the same rights we have offline should be applied online. And I think that's a very important and fundamental but simple statement. And in terms of how the U.S. can better fulfill its obligations, I think you have to go back to how the U.S. understands those obligations, and in particular, how it understands its extraterritorial application of human rights. And this is something that has been an ongoing discussion between the U.S. and the international community. The Human Rights Committee, which is the expert body that oversees government implementation of the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has over and over again, this committee has said that the obligations apply extraterritorially, and not just within the actual land within the territory, but also within what's called the effective control or power of that government. And the internet calls into question some bigger, what is power, what is effective control, and I think especially with looking at state surveillance and some of the issues that have come up in the last year, this is a very critical question. And a few people have mentioned the High Commissioner's report, which was released today, and this report in fact said that the obligations apply no matter where they're happening within the effective control. So I think this is one ongoing issue that applies in the digital age, but also before that, one that we can go back to. And then going to some of the other points that were raised today in terms of funding, I think funding for activists, for people who are at risk around the world is incredibly important. And it's also problematic for people in parts of the world to accept U.S. funding because of some of the credibility problems that surveillance has come into question. And I think that funding should continue, and it's important for it to happen. It's just a matter of how do we make sure that people who need it most are getting it, and that it doesn't put them into any dangerous positions because of that. And just maybe one third point is on the Freedom Online Coalition. From an outsider's perspective who's participated in some of the meetings, it's been really interesting to see how the coalition started out looking at least from an outsider's perspective, where some of the darkest parts of the world where freedom online is in threat, and how the coalition could act to address these problems and to support activists in those countries. And it's been interesting to see with the Talent Declaration issues like surveillance coming up, and looking inward as well. And I think that would be my last point, is to say, to be a leader, you have to sort of get your own cards in house in order. And it's great to see some of these domestic processes taking off, and just being aware of the more reforms that can happen domestically will improve our leadership abroad. And the Freedom Online Coalition seems to be starting to do that, and the more that can continue, I think will be a positive point.
Thank you. Yes,
React to
I
some
was
of the
about to.
comments? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for all those excellent comments. So let me address first the issue just raised by Deborah and also by Ben of sort of the U.S. walking the walk, not just talking the talk on these issues. And you're absolutely right. I mean, my responsibility at the State Department is not domestic policy. There's no question that ensuring that our domestic policies line up with and reinforce what we're trying to do internationally is critical. And the President recognizes this as well. Indeed, he has articulated a reform agenda back in his speech in January. That reform agenda has been further articulated in John Podesta's, the report done under John Podesta's leadership on big data. Obviously, there are certain reforms that the President's already made in terms of surveillance. Others require congressional action. He has ordered greater transparency in terms of decisions made by the Pfizer court and elsewhere to the extent possible. And I think the most significant thing, at least one of the issues that we at the State Department are most concerned about, is trying to eliminate the line between U.S. citizens and foreign citizens when it comes to protection of privacy. Given the global character of the internet, that line is a bit of an artificial one. Yeah. And so the President, both in his speech in January and then in the report on big data, there are clear commitments there to try to extend privacy protections that now apply to U.S. citizens to foreign citizens to the extent possible. Now, the precise details of that are still being worked out, but there's a commitment there. Now, Deborah pointed out, whether or not certain obligations the U.S. has taken on in terms of human rights should apply extraterritorially. It is not our position that, as a legal matter, those rights apply extraterritorially. But as a policy matter, we try to do everything we can to demonstrate our fealty to those norms globally. So whether it involves our policies in terms of detention and the like, and torture, we seek to apply those globally. Similarly, with this attempt to apply privacy internationally, that's what we're after as well. In terms of Avri's point on multi-stakeholderism, we are very, very, very strongly committed to that model. The FOC started and continues to be a multi-stakeholder process. You heard from Ambassador Holden this morning, and you'll hear from my boss and Chris Painter over lunchtime the depth of our commitment to such a model. It is not a perfect model, and it can be challenging. I know there's a lot of, for those of you who were at Net Mundial in Brazil, I know there was a lot of ferment and discussion in civil society about whether multi-stakeholderism was really working. So I think we do need to refine, to the extent we can, how multi-stakeholder processes work, particularly in this space. But we remain deeply committed to such a model and will continue to be so. And I think Alberto's made a very, very good point. Yes, human rights, were primarily articulated to constrain the actions of states. But in our world, we've come to see, both on the internet and frankly elsewhere, that lots of activities go on that impact human rights. And so we have been very active participants in the process around the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, led by John Ruggie, and believe strongly that those principles should apply to the internet space as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Busby. So I have another question for you guys. I think we have merged two of my questions so far, but a follow-up question on that, that countries including Brazil, where I'm from, Kenya, the Netherlands, and Sweden have taken a leadership role in digital rights. And I think Brazil is a clear example with the Marco Civil, which was approved during the Net Mundial, and all of us were there watching that moment. So in the wake of these Snowden revelations, do countries still look to the US as a role model, or these other countries are providing now alternatives? So this is a little bit compare, and I do think this goes to what Ben was mentioning on trust, but also goes on something we're going to discuss later with Laura Denardes on the future of the internet governance environment.
So I think it's really important as we think about these issues to not group countries together and identify them just at the country level first and foremost. Because countries have obviously multiple agencies and other things that can oftentimes do conflicting things, as we know, and I'm sure Scott knows intimately well, that we need to really analyze each of these positive steps that countries are making in a much broader context. For example, in Brazil's Marco Civil, something that was very progressive in the way that we all think about these issues. It still has a history and other things of more restrictive speech laws. We noticed at Google when one of our executives was detained over a YouTube video that was posted in that country. You could look at Turkey in the same way. I believe that Turkey was one of the countries in their mission in Geneva that helped craft that really helpful UN human rights resolution about freedoms on the internet. And again, they have a history of blocking services and also passing laws that can give authority to administration officials to block content. So, yes, other countries are doing many things that are progressive and are role models in those areas, but to say that the U.S. has lost its influence in some way, or other countries have assumed as the distinct role model, I think is simplifying it just a little bit too much. So yeah, I think the macro level analysis is helpful, but for instance, I believe it was Reporters Without Borders, they used to put out enemies of the internet report. And instead of just looking at countries and identifying countries as enemies of the internet, they're now looking at specific agencies and other things. So I think that type of analysis is really key.
Avery, on all that?
Yeah, guess we're gonna go in order. Yeah, I always have a problem with going in order. I think that actually the frame of reference on the discussion has changed in that the U.S. is no longer the shining paradigm, and it just isn't. That is gone. And so what we have to look at is, and I agree with you, it's not, is this country a good example? Is that country a good example? It's looking at various processes, various actions in various areas. And so certainly, the U.S. does focus on a freedom of expression more than many others, and yet it has gag rules galore. So it's quite easy to gag that freedom of expression in the U.S. And so even then, it's something that we have certainly named one of our top goods, but is it always a top good that we defend is something that's questionable. I think what we have to start doing is looking at, in a particular area, on a particular issue, who is being a good example. So we can look at Marco Civil, and we don't need to necessarily bring in other issues. We can look at the Freedom Online Coalition and not worry about perhaps. So it's basically, we have a wider field of good examples now, and I think instead of looking at it is the U.S. losing its predominance? We should just say, yeah, it has. In terms of human rights, we have given that up. We may be able to re-earn it someday, but at the moment, whether you could measure it objectively or not, I don't know, but it's certainly, on a global sense, it's a preeminence that has been surrendered. But that doesn't mean that we still don't do a lot of good, and we still can't earn our way back to preeminence by example, by doing stuff, by correcting, by no longer gagging when somebody is requested for information and so on. So I think we can get a certain bit of the shine back. But at the moment, I think we just have to admit that we are one of many, and we have to keep striving to give good example.
I totally agree with how he said. I have the perception that the U.S. still play a leading role, especially in free speech, but it's a narrow free speech. Still, scholars, policymakers, and activists look at the U.S. to see what are the developments of free speech. Not for privacy, certainly. And in free speech is also, the U.S. is playing a leading role in how to handle free speech with respect to the government. So, for instance, the fact that 1/3 of the notice and taken requests by the teams here are not granted in the law, and therefore the notice and taken requests are working as a private mechanism for censoring, say something. The fact that, as a professor at this university have documented, there has been a lot of cases in which free speech has been at risk because of lacking of net neutrality shows that we are having also pressure to deal with free speech in relation with private actors, and we are not doing that. And in that point, the U.S. is not a leading role model at all.
Any remarks?
Sure, I agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said. I think a world in which countries are competing to be leaders on internet freedom is a world I don't mind living in, so I see this actually as a positive development. And just to add to some of the points, I mean, maybe the U.S. as a paragon of internet freedom, maybe that has been lost, maybe that never really was in truth. I mean, there's a lot of countries with great policies as well, but even with what we've seen the last year or so, and the different countries that are going through domestic processes and reforms, talking to colleagues working in some of those countries in the UK, in Australia and other places, and non-Five Eye countries, so to speak, are having challenges, and they're actually looking at some of the developments here in a positive light, the kind of things we're having domestically. So I think in that sense, there is still this notion that, you know, the U.S. democratic process and the free speech elements and the openness to discuss these issues publicly is something that other countries still look up to. So I wouldn't say it's totally gone, to have a little bit more of an optimistic perspective.
Perfect. Yes.
First, in terms of judging countries' practices, I would commend to everyone Freedom House's annual report on freedom on the net, which is an attempt to objectively evaluate all countries. While we were in Estonia at the Freedom Online Coalition meeting, the Estonians pointed out that they were ranked higher than the U.S. They were second to Iceland, which is the top-ranked country when it comes to internet freedom, but higher than us. Nonetheless, the U.S. remains very much in the top bracket on these issues, despite some of the shortcomings. Let me go back to something I said in my opening remarks on surveillance. We do believe it very important, now that we've entered the sort of post-Snowden era, not to say that surveillance can't happen, because no government facing the sorts of threats that we are can throw surveillance out the window. And there always is going to be a certain degree of secretiveness about some of those practices. Yet at the same time, what we have tried to do in coordination and collaboration with our Freedom Online Coalition members is articulate the principles that should guide surveillance in democratic societies such as our own. And we've had that debate to some extent with civil society. I think we should continue to have that debate. And we would urge all of you in having that debate to focus your attention not just on the United States, but other countries as well. And in that regard, let me just point out, I think the Snowden revelations have obviously focused a great deal of attention in the U.S., and there is a lot we need to do here to improve our own practices. But I think there has been a little bit of a blurring of the line between, say, who we are as a country and the principles that guide the work we do, and say countries like China that clearly are unprincipled in the way in which they go about their own surveillance practices, in the ways in which they use information online to actively persecute people who oppose the government, in the ways in which they censor and prevent people from having access to information. So I would urge all of you, as we engage in this debate, while continuing to press the United States to live up to our own principles and to abide by human rights as much as we possibly can, to also be clear in your interventions about the ways in which what we do can be distinguished from what governments like Iran, China, Russia, and other human rights abusing countries engage in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think now we open the 30 minutes debate with audience and remote participation. We have one question here and then one question there. Okay, if you can be brief, so we have a lot of go ahead.
Very briefly, I want to, I'm Mike Godwin with Internews. I think this follows up on Deborah's comment about being a little more optimistic. I think one of the things that we've seen is that very few governments are willing to blanketly forego their prerogative to engage in surveillance. But what we are seeing as a result of the events in the last year has been an increased public dialogue about what transparency, accountability, due process, and privacy protections ought to look like. And I'm wondering if this is an area, at least, in which the United States can aspire maybe to being a leading example. So I put this to the panelists.
So I'm gonna get 3 questions, and then are you guys okay with that?
David Johnson, I wonder if you could be more specific about how protection of human rights relates to the multi-stakeholder institutions. If, for example, there were a multi-stakeholder institution that controlled access to resources like domain names that are very valuable for people to express themselves, and I thought I heard a suggestion that even though that might be a private organization, it should be subject to the same human rights principles. But how specifically could those be brought to bear and enforced in that context? If the organization says we're a private company, we're not subject to the human rights regime at all, are you suggesting the government should intervene to impose that obligation, or are you suggesting some other mechanism by which at least the free expression values could be enforced?
I've been very impressed with how state has coordinated internet policies, including human rights, except in one area, and that's trade, where in trade agreements, the U.S. government is trying to promote the free flow of information, but also limit restrictions on the free flow of information. And that's a tremendous opportunity to look at policies more coherently and to promote a wide range of human rights. And yet, DRL is not a part of those discussions. It's ED's turf. And I wonder why that is, and why state doesn't take a more proactive role in trying to use trade agreements both to advance human rights and to limit restrictions on human rights.
Okay, we have 3 questions now. Let's just go with those, and then I will take 4 more 3 questions.
Going in order?
Going in order.
No need for order.
No order?
I'm happy to address the business and human rights question from at least our perspective. So we certainly recognize that businesses have a very strict responsibility to respect human rights, obviously. That's been delineated many times at the UN and other places as well. In terms of violations of human rights, that's within the purview of governments to actually violate people's human rights, and that can be facilitated through businesses and other things. So that's kind of the frame that we take that. Multi-stakeholder institutions like the Global Network Initiative, I think, is a huge step in the right direction. What we did essentially was just establish principles for how businesses should interact with privacy and freedom of expression, dealing with government requests for data and government requests to remove information. And to make those principles public, to make companies commit to them who join the organization, and then to have some sort of process to review whether or not they're upholding their commitments and have internal review. And part of that multi-stakeholder process, too, is something where you can have conversations internally within the organization about challenges that it faces in these specific issues. So I think those are, making sure that companies are following the strong principles to ensure that they are not facilitating human rights violations are really important. And anything that the U.S. government and others can do to spread those principles more widely beyond just the small handful of companies who operate in that fora today, to other companies, to non-U.S. companies, to startups who never think about these issues until some crisis happens with the data they collect or other things, I think is really important.
Related to the question about the design for enforcing human rights respect to an institutional arrangement for internet governance, that is part of the institutional arrangement that we need to deal with. There are several solutions already available over there. We have countries that have submitted their jurisdiction to international bodies. Practically all the European countries are dealing with a regional mechanism for solving human rights issues. It's the same as some African countries and Latin American countries. Other countries are committing to respect human rights, but in a given point or a given jurisdiction, if, for instance, the Inter-American Development Bank, the jurisdiction is the Washington, D.C. Now, the problem is that the jurisdiction also determines what is the law that should be applied for that body. Should be the American law or should be the French law? My perception is it should be a global framework, and I think that in the spirit of their general statement and ambiguities, human rights provide that framework. And related to trade agreements, I agree with the fact that it seems to me, as an internet scholar, that it's more interesting for me to study the USTR policies than the Department of State policies at international levels. I think that the USTR is pushing much further on internet issues. Unfortunately, from my viewpoint, the USTR is pushing for a trade agenda, not for human rights agenda. So I wouldn't confuse that in the sense that dealing with human rights in a trade environment, trade negotiations with trade institutions of several countries, they are going to get a trade outcome, not a human rights outcome. So I'm not sure if supporting dealing with human rights in trade negotiations, but I totally support to deal with human rights in order to prevent that trade negotiations produce a bad outcome that may affect human rights. So, for instance, it's really good to have the USTR pushing for free flow of information, but it's really bad that it's doing that by diminishing privacy or protection of personal information of people. It's really good to have the USTR pushing for net neutrality overseas, but it's really bad that it's doing it only for doing businesses, not for people. It's not for you or for me. It's only for doing businesses. So it will be great to have more consistency in the domestic policy as well as in the foreign policy that the US is having on internet issues, in a way that both the US Department but also the USTR are talking the same language, are getting from overseas countries the same level of commitments.
Can I respond to this? Let me respond to the comments in reverse order. Susan, I agree with Alberto that human rights should be part of our trade negotiations and agreements. USTR does have the lead, and we are involved. We don't have the lead, obviously, but we get to see the agreements. Labor protections, of course, have now become a standard feature of all trade agreements. So now, we need to get to the next level on internet issues as well. Very complicated. But I would point out that in the TPP context, the Trans-Pacific Partnership context, there is a sort of savings clause in that agreement that says this agreement, shall be consistent with all existing treaty obligations and commitments, which we read as giving us the leverage to ensure that principles of free expression, free association, et cetera, including those that are exercised online, should be part of our assessment of how that agreement is implemented. That said, from where we sit, ideally in the future, we would get other human rights besides labor protections expressly identified in trade agreements. In response to the business question, I heard in your question, concern about ICANN in particular and that particular issue, and I would note that as part of the ICANN process, there is the Government Advisory Committee, I believe it's called, the GAC, which the ICANN listens to. I mean, they're not bound by it, but the GAC does speak to a lot of these issues and oftentimes does raise human rights concerns. Not always, I should say. There are other factors that drive government policy on internet naming, but the GAC, at least in that process, gives governments the opportunity to speak to human rights concerns and seek to protect them. And indeed, the U.S., I think, has been trying to protect those values in that process as much as we possibly can. Separately, as Ben pointed out, a private body such as ICANN also does have the right to respect human rights under the Ruggie principles. And then to Mike's excellent question, I couldn't agree more. Given the issues that have come up in the wake of the Snowden revelations, I do think the U.S. and other countries needs to aspire to now, what does transparency look like in the age of surveillance? What is due process? Those are the questions we're grappling right now with the president's reforms, and we think they're critical to our credibility in terms of trying to promote the internet freedom agenda globally.
Avery, back to you. Out of order.
Thank you. I think we let companies off a little too easily when we say it's only the governments that have signed these human rights treaties, and therefore the companies are free to do as they please. And I know I'm exaggerating a little, and it's not what you all have said, but I certainly, it's sort of an attitude that, you know, it's the country's responsibility. And indeed, if companies do want to lay it completely on their government's doorstep, then that is an invitation to the governments to regulate, and I'm not adverse to regulation when it's needed. I prefer to see self-regulation when it's possible. And I think that the governments, in their commitment to see human rights protected, have sort of taken on the responsibility to encourage, to cajole, and perhaps to reward, and perhaps to regulate human rights when necessary to meet the commitments that they've made. Now, the question was also asked, what can multi-stakeholder do about that? And I think that's the other part of the it's almost a pincher movement on these companies, is that whether it's an organization like ICANN that attempts to have a full representation of the stakeholders, or whether it's a corporation where the stakeholders are called consumers and customers, it's that those people need to insist on it. They need to insist bottom up in their, as consumers, as stakeholders, as whatever, that those companies do live up to the human rights. You know, and companies can do a lot about it. They can have human rights advocates. Some are starting to. You know, there's even been a recommendation, it hasn't gotten very far yet, you know, within ICANN to think about a human rights advisory committee, something that is actually following what is being done all the time and advises on human rights in the same sense that people advise on stability. And I'm really glad that you mentioned GAC and that I went after you, because there was that marvelous document from the Council of Europe that was submitted to the GAC, and I assume is going to be discussed going forward in terms of ICANN's responsibilities for human rights and GAC's responsibilities for saying something about it. So indeed, those are coming together, and I don't have the URL on me, but that Council of Europe document on ICANN and human rights is really a wonderful read.
I was checking to see if there are any remote participants' questions. I haven't seen any so far, so back to the audience. I think you have one on the back there. One in the front here. Okay. Start one here and then move on there.
Hello there.
Hi, Susan Chalmers. Thank you to the panel for a very robust discussion. It's great to see so many different viewpoints up there. My question is about creating new law to protect and promote human rights online. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the binary framing of the online-offline distinction. So it had been mentioned before that new rights should not be created, that the existing rights should be translated into the online environment. But as we've seen, the internet is capable of rendering some laws functionally obsolete, some laws remain unchanged, and some new laws have been created in light of the internet. And so I think of it more as a continuum instead of a binary framing. So I guess my question to the panel is how, unless you're relying on the development of jurisprudence, how are human rights translated into the internet environment without the creation of new law?
Over there in the back.
I guess I have a mic.
No, you go ahead.
All right, thank you. My name's Tom Lowenhaupt. I'm involved with Connecting.nyc. We're a not-for-profit that advocates for the development of the .nyc top-level domain as a public interest resource. And the issue that we're struggling with these days is a governance process for .nyc. What's a multi-stakeholder governance process look like for a city TLD? And I'm just wondering if anybody has any thoughts on that and how that can from the top down in this instance. And also curious if maybe there are any thoughts from Mr. Blink in terms of the commons names that Google will have, like talk, eat, book, baby, dad, whether there is any multi-stakeholder governance in the use of those commons terms. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Steve Metalitz. The panel has emphasized the breadth of the International Human Rights Framework, and we've had very good discussion about several aspects of it. I'd like to ask about one that hasn't been specifically mentioned, which is Article 27.2 of the Universal Declaration, which is each individual's right to enjoy the material and moral benefits of creative works of which they are the author. It's a right that's widely disrespected on the internet, and I just wonder if the panelists have thoughts about how that should figure into the internet governance debate and to the policy questions that you're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, now with 3 questions, I come back to you guys who want to address some of those questions, please. Any order.
I got a direct question, so I can go with that.
Sure,
first.
go ahead.
Unfortunately, it's a disappointing one for Tom, because I'm not exactly sure what the process looks like, but I'm very happy to find out for you. My colleagues work on that very closely. So that was a quick one.
Okay, so just to follow with the tradition of quick answer, how to develop human rights without law? I don't see many choices, to be honest. We will need law, especially if we are trying to push for this at the international level. We can have a GNI, but GNI may fly in the US. It doesn't fly anywhere else. We can have an agreement between 2 or 3 businesses in the West Coast, but it doesn't fly anywhere else. And if you are talking about having human rights respect on a global environment, you need a global mechanism. And that global mechanism today is international law. And yes, the Articles 27, second part, it also has a first part that talk about providing access to knowledge and the benefits of the progress of the science, technology, and education to people. So it's a balance. To which extent intellectual property is a human right? It's very teeny. It's very teeny. If you go to the drafting process of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the drafting process of all the international instruments on human rights that refer to intellectual property, they actually refer to creators. So they are talking only about authors of copyright. They are not talking about patent. They are not talking about trademark. They are talking about copyright. But they are talking about human rights related with copyright. Those are rights that are inalienable. So they refer to the actual author. It doesn't refer to Hollywood, Sony, or any IFP conglomerate, but to authors. And which rights? those rights that he cannot give up. So it doesn't refer to economic rights then, because economic rights are precisely rights that you can't give up. So what is the scope of a human right? An author's right is puny.
Did you want to go?
Go ahead, Harvey.
Yeah, I wanted to comment because I was glad you brought up the new rights and in the same way. And in fact, when I'd heard it, I had written it down on my note here, but then just never gotten to talk about it. And I hadn't thought of it necessarily in the continuum that you think of, but what I did think of is that you have the same rights. And so it isn't a question of creating a new rights, but they do manifest differently. They are expressed differently. And so there needs to be something that's now, whether in all cases it is law, I don't believe. I think law is part of the package. And that's why I was sort of saying earlier, if we can self-regulate without law, if we can, I mean, law is only necessary because we don't behave. So it's changing our behavior patterns is something to attempt because law is also usually very much of a one-size-fits-all solution, and that is always a problematic with law. It's not law per se that is the problem. It's that any law that you create is basically constrained to a certain set of circumstances, and then beyond that, you have the opportunity for those that know how to game law. And so law is always possible. It's always I think of it as the solution of last resort. There are other ways. There is the self-regulation. There is the bottom-up processes that bring many more viewpoints into it. There's making sure that there's mechanisms to appeal, to be visible, to be transparent. And you're right, law when absolutely nothing else will work, but I have seen very few laws that don't create yet a new problem. And so how do you create a law that doesn't build a new opportunity for somebody to get rich skirting the law is always the problem I look at when we sort of say, let's move beyond self-regulation to law. In terms of the rights of the creator, I think they're actually very important. And the rights are to be able to live, to be able to make a living, not to basically be able to dominate knowledge in such a way that it can't be shared freely. So again, within the human rights, there's always the balance. Yes, the creator has the right. Yes, the person has the right to materials they need to make a living for themselves. Where we get into sort of issues is in, does my making a living require that no one else have the knowledge that I have, that no one else experience the music that I've created? Or do we need a way of saying, yes, as the creator of that music, I have a right to have a good life, you know, from what it makes, but that doesn't mean that I get to control it in all ways at all times, and I can transfer that to others. So it's always looking at these rights as balanced by all the other rights. But you're right, it is indeed there, and it is something that you know, the creators of music and photography and so on do need their right to make a living off their product protected.
Can I?
Final comment and then back to the audience, yeah.
Just also in response to Susan, I do think, building on the point that Avery made, I think it's important to distinguish rights and laws. I mean, laws are how rights are expressed, but by saying that the same rights apply offline as online, that doesn't mean that laws won't change. So long as you may need new laws, but so long as they are consistent with those existing rights, then, you know, we would say that's fine. So laws are kind of a more specific manifestation of rights that we believe themselves don't need to change.
Can I make just one more
And
point?
Deborah,
Just quickly to build on what everyone's been saying is that I think obviously laws will need to be updated or modified slightly, but I think it's also a matter of informing and educating law enforcement and judiciaries, because even for well-protected or well-legislated issues such as violence against women, violations against women online aren't really recognized. Cyberbullying and types of things we're seeing lately, law enforcement doesn't understand it as violations of human rights or of law in the way that they would understand an offline version of that. So I think it's a matter of the continuum of how things manifest themselves and how to educate and update law enforcement and judiciary.
Sure, back to you, and I just want to use the privilege of moderator and also add a question. So in reconsidering the Millennium Goals, some countries are thinking to take out the right to access information out of those goals. What do you think of that, and how you see this relating exactly to this discussion or even U.S. policy of enforcing human rights internationally? And then back to you.
Oh, you want me to ask the question?
Yeah, you have a question, right?
I wanted to go back to, my name is Samira Daniels, and I'm interested in internet freedom. And this is for Alberto. You framed the issue of, freedoms in terms of the concerns about private, what would the private companies be doing with the information. And this discussion has been going on with some retired government officials and, in the media. And I'm really confused by it because what is it that the private companies would do that might be even more nefarious or, impose on the on freedoms of people that the governments, I'm very confused by the way it's been framed, because all along in other countries, it's the the commercialization of knowledge and the ability to sell that knowledge at whatever, which is considered the most, imposing in terms of intellectual property rights, corporate surveillance, getting the edge. So, but I'm still sort of confused as what you see as the sort of, what is it that we have to deal with to sort of improve the situation of civil liberties and protections of freedoms. I'm not. I know it's a lot of discussion, but it's still not. I'd like like one sentence. Sure. What you think needs to be done.
Another question there on the back. Oh no, I'm sorry. Would you mind giving to her? I remember her. She's since the beginning with her hand raised.
Oh. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Eileen Donahoe. I wanted to ask a question about the larger geopolitical context of internet governance that's going on globally and articulating the relevance of human rights to the internet governance conversation, which may seem obvious to everyone in this room, but I've heard a lot of conversations where various stakeholders do not see that as obvious, why human rights should be central. And if you look at the success of Net Mundial, a couple of big picture reasons it was so successful is demonstrated for everyone how multi-stakeholderism can work in real time, but also gave pride of place to human rights in the outcome document. And that was really a significant achievement. So I'm wondering how the panelists are thinking strategically about how to convince stakeholders around the world in these various fora how and why human rights must be given pride of place. Why are they important? Even in the context of organizing this day, not all of the stakeholders understood the relevance and centrality of human rights. So I'm curious about your strategies for that.
Okay, to some extent building on that, but how are we taking this issue into other major fora that are going on where internet governance and human rights matter? And I'm thinking of the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals. It seems like a different issue. There are a different set of experts working on it, a different set of policymakers, but at the same time, there are, going back to the issue of trade as well, there are other processes and mechanisms going on where there's an opportunity to insert this as a key issue and to have this as a priority. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
That connects with my question. So who wants to lead this debate? Thank you.
On Eileen's good question about human rights and internet governance, I think, it boils down to the issue of whether, who are going to be the entities deciding what the rules are for the internet. And if the form of internet governance is one that primarily or exclusively involves states, that means that big, powerful states like China and Russia are going to be major players in developing and implementing such policies. And given the ways in which those governments treat their own citizens and are generally not interested in human rights violations committed in other countries that they may have alliances with, I think that's cause for concern. So I think the connection is simply what do we think the UN, given all its limitations, is the right forum to govern the internet? And I think, our strong belief is that while certain issues can and should be debated in the UN, that would be a mistake, that would give too much power to non-rights respecting countries in the further evolution of the internet. And one of the reasons the internet has been such a great success is that it hasn't been subject to those powers and influences. On the MDGs, I think both excellent points. I'm not familiar enough with where things stand currently in the debate. I know that we're making best efforts to ensure that respect for human rights is incorporated throughout the document. I need to look specifically at the right to access information issue and see where it stands, but that's a very fair point, and I'll leave it at that.
In terms of the question of bringing the human rights concern into other fora, I think the fact that it got into this fora, I don't know if thinking about it strategically, but more tactically, it's the people that are basically arguing it are going to all fora and arguing for it is indeed one way. I think one of the entry points is often, other than, everyone says I have a right at some point and that opens up the subject, but almost all of these organizations can quite quickly look at what are the principles on which they are running their organization, they are running their forum. The notion of what principles are guiding us is something that almost every organization, every fora has tackled at some point. And that conversation is always the entry point for the principles have to be consistent. And they have to be consistent with human rights principles. And I think that is an entry point for almost any forum, any organization, when you want to, because if you just come and say, human rights are important, it's yeah. But if you look at the principles that you say are important to you as an organization, and then you basically can say, and look how these pin back to human rights, and then look at the implications of that on the other things you do have a tactical measure. Whether that counts as a strategy, I don't know, but I tend to look at one forum, one meeting, one event at a time, and how do you get human rights in the discussion of that particular organization, whether it's this one, ICANN, IGF, or the ITU.
I totally support the idea that what is relevant for engaging people in human rights is that the human rights is the framework that today provides us a global approach that is not only endorsed by the US and democratic government. Several authoritarian governments have also endorsed international instruments. They may not live every day with their human rights, but they are aware about them and they hide their human rights violations, so they know they are misbehaving. So human rights is the legal framework that we should push forward to regulate this global phenomenon on the internet. There is other choice? Yes, we have another choice. We can go, instead of going to human rights framework, we can go to a trade framework. And we can deal with that at the World Trade Organization, with free trade agreements, with the USTR at the table. But I wish that is not the choice that we made. Second, I don't think that human rights only require obligations from private actors. But certainly, at least indirectly, they are required to comply with human rights standards too. Sometimes we overstate the power of governments overseas because we live with a powerful government in the US. And our examples are China, Russia, maybe Brazil. But most countries do not have powerful governments. In most Latin American countries, I will say that the governments are weaker than Telefónica, the main telecom company from Spain, or Telmex, the main telecom company from Mexico. Much weaker. They control together practically 80% of the telecommunications. So it's important for us. Someone asked me once, why when we talk about Latin America, we talk about banana republics? And it's because the banana company was running the country for real. And that is the reason why in Latin American countries, at least, there may be other reasons in other countries. Constitutions pays close attention why private actors, those former banana companies, should also respect human rights because they don't have a strong governments. A lot of human rights violations came from the private actors. The other things is that, and building on the top of what Scott said, when we are talking about framing internet governance with the human rights framework, it doesn't mean to close a discussion. Saying that you have the right to speak or that you have the right to privacy doesn't mean that there is no chances to set some limitation or exceptions and surveillance in certain cases. I doubt that the case of the NSA can comply with any international human rights test. But in certain cases, could be justified by international human rights law too. So human rights are relative. They allow for limitation and exceptions. The problem that we are having with international human rights law today is that we are having not only problem with recalcitrant human rights violation countries, but also with democratic countries.
Okay, so so we have actually to close this panel. I'm giving it 5 minutes, so 1 minute more actually. But I would love to hear you guys just your hopes and thoughts for the upcoming IGF and how you would hope this discussion would feed into that. So that just really to close our panel and then move for the lunch session.
So the upcoming IGF, I really think it's important that governments and other citizens as well go home and think about what their domestic laws mean for human rights in their own countries and what examples that's setting for the rest of the international community. I think it's important both for small countries and for large countries overall. But as we are talking about international standards, international regulations or laws or other things that determine how human rights are enforced, we really need to start with the laws that don't specifically mention human rights or weren't considered for human rights in the first place. Things like surveillance, again, things like access that governments have to private company data and other things like that. It's those types of laws that are really going to be role modeling. And I hope that conversation happens there.
Thank you.
Hopes for the IGF. I guess that the conversation about human rights becomes more pervasive, perhaps as pervasive as surveillance, and that the IGF figures out how to actually produce something out of all of that.
My long-term wish is that we start a conversation about how to enforce human rights in a digital environment. I don't think that there is a question about if human rights apply to the internet. They apply. Nobody said the opposite, actually. But the question is, how do we enforce those rights when they are being violated all over the world in the online environment?
Three things. One, I think if we could see or achieve greater consensus around what are the principles that guide democratic rights-respecting governments when it comes to their use and engagement of the internet, I think would be very useful, and distinguishing that from those countries that do not do that. Two, I think building on the momentum of Net Mundial and the commitment to multi-stakeholderism affirmed there, I think if we can get even more countries, several countries now seem to be moving from the ITU government-centered approach to internet governance to multi-stakeholderism. So if we can continue with that momentum, that would be significant. And third, and perhaps a little bit parochially, if we can use it to get Turkey to improve its own internet behavior, I think that would be lots of progress.
To build on the last point, I think we need to be using the IGF to help support Turkish activists. I understand that all workshop proposals in the formal agenda from Turkish activists or on Turkey were rejected, and I think as the international community, we really need to come in and actually give voice to those people and find creative ways to do so. And then building on Net Mundial, that show that actually outcomes can come from a multi-stakeholder initiative, and the IGF is due to expire next year. So I think the more that we can show the IGF has worth, to actually build on that this year.
Great, so thank you so much. And now I think we're gonna go back to the room where the coffee was for the lunch session.